I need to get this working better. So we are
Huh.
now officially recording. There we go. And Lori's checking in just in time. All right, and I'll send you guys instructions. My intent would be to link it as a blog item off of the class's website because that's the best place that I can embed the link and not have it just out there in the public domain. So that'll work pretty well. All right, last week we talked about what was going on outside of Christendom but was impacting Christendom. Anybody remember what we talked about last week?
Islam.
Yeah, the rise of
Islam.
Islam. So as I mentioned, this is going to be sort of part two of that, what's going on at the same time, sort of in different parts of the world. So that mainly covered what was going on, obviously, in Arabia with the rise of Islam. And if you remember that Islam spread very quickly across into the Levant, what we think was the modern day Holy Land, across Egypt, across North Africa, swept up into the area that we think of as modern day Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, went east into the Persian Empire. And all of that happened in a fairly fast period of time, literally a matter of about 150 years for that full spread. What we're going to switch over to today, we're going to talk about two things that are intertwined. And so it makes it a little tricky about how we talk about them. And that's what's going on primarily in Europe with respect to what happens after the fall of Rome. And we're going to see that does connect back to what we talked about last week in a very powerful way. And it connects back to the development of church organization and theology, because what's going on in Europe and what's going on inside of the church as an organized institution, particularly the Catholic Church, is a connection between political and papal things that are happening. The rise of the papacy is tied to the rise, for example, of what's going on by particularly one particular group inside of Europe, which is the rise of the Franks. And so we'll try to connect those dots today to see how the position of Pope evolved during that period of time. And that really sets us up well for getting up to the great schism, the great split between the Eastern and Western Church, and then back into where we'll really get back into some theological things as we start talking about the move towards the Reformation. So this is going to feel a little bit more today, a lot more like some history versus some theology, but I think you'll see how it plays into using the technical theological term ecclesiology, which is the organization of the church in particular, as the way that it plays through and the way that it shows itself. So moving into that, first thing I want to show here is, click on the correct screen. This is a really rough timeline for what you might refer to as Latin Christendom. Anybody know why the term Latin is used here?
Roman spoken Latin.
Correct. And so this is what you'll see, some terms used interchangeably. We'll talk about Latin Christendom, that's distinguished from Eastern Christendom or Greek Christendom. You remember we've talked about this so many times, the Roman Empire split into two halves. And so there was the Western part, which was still centered in Rome. And remember, Constantine had established his new capital where?
Constantinople.
Correct, which is over in the eastern half of what had been the Roman Empire. And then later, the eastern part of the empire that's based in Constantinople, another term for that city is Byzantium, becomes the Byzantine Empire. So we use a lot of these terms interchangeably, and when I go and find resources on the web that I don't want to just totally redo, and this is a good example of this timeline here, you'll see different things that are used. So Latin Christendom refers to Christianity as it grew in what had been the western part of the Roman Empire. And again, while the date is sort of arbitrary because they had already lost some significance, they'd already previously been the city had once been sacked before by the Goths and the Vandals. In 476 is what most historians will use as sort of the official end of the Roman Empire, the sacking of Rome and the change of what happens there. And so this is the key date that we'll be centering around. Again, we'll be picking this up from the European side of history and what's going on in the church as well, but again, focusing primarily on the Latin part of Christendom, the so-called Western side. One of the things that's key to note here is what had already started to happen beginning in about AD 400 and afterwards. There was already a decline in urban population. The people that were living in cities was actually going down because the empire, which had been so urban-centric in so many ways, was already in decline. And so a lot of the population was already moving out. Part of this was just because of necessity. You didn't have the strength of the empire, the trade of the empire. You didn't have grain coming in from Egypt in quite the same way to the west as it used to come into. And so people actually needed to go out in the country to actually farm and provide their own sustenance. And so you saw a decline in urban populations just because there wasn't the network or the infrastructure to support them. We've already talked about this. We talked about 622 being the founding of Islam and the Muslim expansion. We'll spend some time today talking about this important event in 732, which is the turning back of the expansion of Islam at the Battle of Tours. And then we'll ultimately sort of get down to Charlemagne being one of the last major figures that we're going to look at today, who in 800 is actually crowned as the Emperor of the Romans. Depending on whose viewpoint you want to take, he's the quote-unquote first Holy Roman Emperor, whether you consider that to be him or 150 years later when that role sort of changes. And then we'll talk about the Treaty of Verdun. This is all part of the political history of the Western side of what had been the Roman Empire, but how it ties to the church. So any questions about where we were last week before we move on to start today? All right. Today we're going to, again, talk about two things that are intertwined, but we're going to talk about them separately because it's really hard to try to intertwine the moving two. And the first of those is the rise of the Franks. When I say Franks, does anybody have any concepts in their head about who the Franks were?
French, right?
They become the French.
They're a Germanic tribe.
They're Germanic tribes. And I really struggle with that in my head, Mickey, because when I see Franks and I know that eventually they are what becomes what we think of as being France, I don't immediately think German. But they are Germanic tribes that become eventually to occupy the area that we know of as France derives its name from the Franks, and they become the French. And from the period of time from roughly from the early 600-ish on, we're going to, as we go through this, we'll see this, until about the year 900, Europe is dominated to a great degree by this people group and what's happening with them, and how they interact with the church that's based in Rome becomes very, very important.
What was Germany called before it was called Germany?
It wasn't.
It had no. Then why were they called Germanic tribes if it wasn't?
Because that's the people group. Modern, well, how do you even define modern Germany? Germanic people, including these tribes, had existed for a long period of time. Modern Germany, as we know it, does not come to be until the late 19th century, when somewhere on the order, I remember numbers of anywhere from 200 to 300 small little German principalities and kingdoms are eventually merged together, primarily under the leadership of Bismarck, into a unified nation. Inside of that, you had major powers like Austria and Prussia, who were larger German states, but you had a lot of smaller German.
Yeah, I didn't think Germany was that big, but the term Germanic tribes is used a lot.
And goes back to this point. And again, we're talking here about, well, we're talking about actually back to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, all the way back to those groups like the Goths and the Visigoths. Depending on where you believe their origins are, they are quote unquote Germanic in their source. And the Germanic there relates to the fact that they spoke a more or less common type of language. So they're a language group as much as they are a people group.
That would
As
include.
a matter of fact, go ahead, Mickey.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say one of the Germanic tribes' names, the Alemannia. That's Alemania is the Spanish
for German.
German.
Right. And when in doubt, a map is always helpful, or at least it is for me. So this is the map of how Europe basically was around 476, or at least the western half of Europe, showing the Italian peninsula and the north of Africa. And so what you see here is there are a number of different lands and kingdoms and areas of control. There are multiple areas that are occupied by people who would have identified as being Franks. There's the Salian Franks, there's the Riparian Franks, this land of Syagrius. Syagrius was the last sort of Roman governor, military commander in this area that had been, this whole area here had been the province of Gaul inside of Rome. And that we basically think modern day France is more or less a good outline there. But as you can see, it was divided up into a number of different people groups and smaller kingdoms. The Visigoths, the western half of the Goths, had come to occupy most of the area of Aquitaine and southern France, and into what we think of today as being modern Spain, here on the Iberian Peninsula. The Vandals, remember, had come down and around, if you remember one of those charts from before, and they had occupied North Africa, and some of the islands here in the Mediterranean had a foothold in Sicily. Odoacer, that we see here, the kingdom of Odoacer, he was one of the Goths who actually was responsible for the final fall of Rome. And so Odoacer is the leader of this group of the Goths, the Eastern Goths. And so this area here becomes his kingdom. Again, we're looking here at a snapshot essentially in 476. And then you have this area, the area of Burgundy, and then some of the other people groups that are around. So you have this very disjointed set of tribes, smaller kingdoms, military controlled areas that had been controlled by Rome. For example, this land of the area that's in blue here. Up on the British Isle, you have the Celts, which historically had been there. You have the Angles and the Saxons who had come across from the continent. You had some Celtic influence down here still in what we think of as modern day France. So the map that you know of or think of for Europe today, very disjointed and very constantly in change during a lot of this period of time. So this is sort of the snapshot of where we begin. Questions about that? If you remember, all of this had been what? Under whose control at one point, particularly back in 117 AD when it was at its peak?
Rome.
This had all been Rome, and Rome had pushed up even into about, half or 2/3 the way, at least as far as Hadrian's Wall, which my wife now has a better understanding of, on the Isle of Great Britain. But as the influence of the empire declined, we actually talked about this. This was part of the influence of the decline, these moving into these German peoples, the Germanic tribes, the Huns, etc. This area becomes very fractured and changes a lot over the couple of hundred years actually before this, and certainly after this. But this is how we find ourselves in 476.
Some of those names.
Go ahead.
Some of those names have managed to be
Survive.
recognizable even today. Some of them have completely disappeared. I don't think I've ever heard of the Sueves, S-U-E, they're in Western Spain, or the, I don't even know how to say it, Kingdom of Odoacer.
Yeah.
And
he actually is Gothic, but he is the leader, and this is a short-lived kingdom here once he's taken control of the Italian peninsula. And for example, we don't see a group here called the Lombards, which will actually be important as we move forward with this narrative, who are going to be in this area here. And you would recognize that term as being something that carries to today. The Basque people, for example, still exist on the border between modern day Spain and southern France. So it is interesting. Yeah, some things carry down and some things don't. One of the other things we haven't done, so this is probably as good a time as any to do it, is we haven't talked a lot about how the island of Great Britain becomes Christian. It actually comes through a number of different ways. Most powerfully, it comes as a result of St. Patrick, which has already happened before this particular point in time, where he particularly goes back and preaches goes back essentially as a missionary after he's been there as a slave. And so eventually, you sort of don't see it on here. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. We'll come back around to it later. But the island of Great Britain becomes Christianized early on during its latter period of its Roman influence, but then it also comes to be Christianized in a unique way moving forward as we'll talk about some things other. We'll touch on that. So just know that that's an area that we still need to cover and we still need to talk about. All right, moving forward here. I want to show this map. This is the area that Christianity has spread to by the time we get to around 800, so where we're going to end up today. You can see the map has gotten bigger. We had the initial areas that were primarily coastal. That's the dark areas. In the period from the 300s to the 600s, Christianity spreads a great deal throughout the areas that were still under Roman control, and then subsequent to that, Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula across North Africa. But then when we had that sweep back by the spread of Islam, this area that was previously Christian in North Africa, remember Alexandria was a center of Christianity. Carthage was, Hippo, some of the cities here on the northern coast. This area gets swept up in the Islamic expansion, and the same is true of Spain. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But we actually have most of Europe being Christianized or exposed to Christianity by the 800s. Important thing to note here, and you now have the context for this, prior to as we start talking about who the Franks are, many of the tribes up in this area in Gaul, some of the Germanic tribes, had converted to Christianity this is after Constantine and the recognition and the end of persecution for Christians inside the Roman Empire. So you saw more missionaries going out. Many of them did convert to Christianity, but a lot of the Christianity that existed here was an Arian form of Christianity. So it wasn't necessarily following along with the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople in its theology. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because that actually becomes an important thing today. There were, among a lot of these quote unquote barbarian tribes, there were Christians. Up until the time of the rise of the Franks, they were more likely to be Arian Christians than they were to be Nicene Christians, just because of who had grown and who had influenced the area. So who are the Franks? Well, again, they were one of these groups. They were nomadic. They were a tribal people, a German tribal people, and they had always existed here, and or they moved into the area through migrations from the period beginning actually about as far back as 200 AD is when we start seeing them really encountered here. But they maintained a lot of influence between the period of about 400 to 700. And they carved up, as we saw on that previous map, they had carved up Europe into a lot of different smaller tribes. They primarily lived in northern Gaul. So the area that you basically see here, this is a much later map, this is 840 AD. But the area that you see that I'm circling around now is primarily where the Franks were. So going back to the map we were looking at before, we talk about the Franks, we're talking about here in the Salian Franks, the Upper Aryan Franks, this area here where it was still under a Roman military leader's control, this upper part of modern day France into Belgium, into the Netherlands, into heading towards Denmark. This was the area that the Franks primarily occupied. And they were broken up into a number of different tribes, and they really didn't have a single leader. They had tribal chieftains who were sort of kings, so they were a people group that were broken up into multiple different areas of influence. At least that was the case until this guy comes along. So who's heard of Clovis before?
I've heard of him. Don't remember why.
There's a city in New Mexico that I don't know if it's necessarily named for him. There's actually archaeologists talk about the Clovis peoples that were occupants of North America before the arrival of Europeans. But the Clovis that we're going to talk about here was a Frankish tribal leader, a king, and he was particularly over the area here of the Salian Franks. So He is in this area right here, this really dark brown area is the area that he has, his family, he inherits the leadership here of this smaller group of Franks that are in the brownish area. Go back. Early on, he is not a Christian. He's a pagan, but he ends up in a political marriage with his wife Clotilda, and she was, and this is actually drawn from the Catholic source. That's why it's got the big C Catholic there. She's a Catholic, but she uniquely among the Christians that are in this part of the world up here, and there are a number of Christians inside of the Frankish kingdom and some of these other kingdoms. For example, she's a princess of Burgundy. A number of them are Arian Christians. It just so happens that Clotilde is a Nicene Christian. So her thoughts on the Trinity and who Jesus is are more in tune with the Orthodox that we spent so much time talking about this. Clovis, like many of the Germanic tribes, were very militaristic, and so he ends up in a conflict with, guess what, another Frankish tribe trying to expand his influence. And depending on which story you want to believe, it's either after a battle or it's before a battle, or it's because of what happens before the battle that while Clovis is a pagan, he prays to God, his wife's God, Clotilda, asking for victory. So if you have a little bit of images here of before a battle, God's going to give you victory, sound like anything we've heard before? Mm-hmm. A little Constantinish maybe, a little Milvian Bridge. He converts to Christianity either after that battle or because of the victory in that battle, which was a close-fought battle that allowed him to expand his kingdom and actually take over one of the rival Frankish kingdoms. So from that point on, this is in 496, he officially declares that Christianity will be the official religion of the Franks. And he ends up recodifying their laws. It's called the Law of the Salian Franks, which is a combination of their customs, Roman law, which still had an influence, but also bringing in Christian ideals. So Clovis becomes the first, if you will, it says here, he was the first of the Frankish kings, and meaning Frankish king in the sense of not just over his tribal group, but over a larger portion of the area that were occupied by the Franks. So if I go back.
Don, can I say something?
Yeah.
Caesar and I found Clovis, where's Clovis and Charles Martel and Charlemagne are buried. They're at the chapel in Saint Denis, which is like the French version of Westminster.
Right. And if you are French, you look back to this as being part of your origin story about how France comes to be. In some ways, Clovis, and then later Charles Martel, because of the influence he's going to have, and then ultimately Charlemagne. These are your, if you will, your French founding fathers in a way. Would you agree with that to some degree?
Yes.
In terms of how they're thought of?
Yeah. Yes.
Only it goes back a lot farther than we do with our founding fathers. So Clovis essentially unites the Franks through military force, and they come together as now being, you can see the area that he controls. Remember, we started out with the brown territory here. Before it's all said and done by 511, by the time of his death, all of this green territory is under the control or influence of Clovis. It looks a lot like what, in terms of its outline?
France.
Modern day France. The exception to that are the Burgundians, who he's sort of aligned with because of who his wife is and where she comes from. And so they grow to be a very large, influential element in Europe here. And you see, for example, many modern cities we know that Paris, Orleans, Bordeaux. These cities had started to grow and existed before, but now they are under the influence of the Franks. What eventually will become, after a period of time, the French. I really feel like I stumbled through that. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
So we'll come back later as we talk about the rise of the papacy, but remember, we're setting up the political side here so we can talk about the religious side. Now, what happens here is these, again, they had not had a unified kingdom before, and so it doesn't take long after Clovis's death that things sort of want to go back to the way that they were. And so to some degree, these areas that he had united together before sort of fall back apart once the influence of him being a powerful individual goes away. And this weird thing sort of happens. They all sort of have separate kingdoms to a degree. And this position known as the mayor of the palace actually ends up being a very powerful position. He's not a king, but he's the prime minister. He's the one that's in charge of the palace and in charge of the armies in a united sense. And so what happens is this guy by the name of Charles Martel comes along, and eventually he's in that role where he actually is the mayor of the palace, or the prince of the Franks. So he's not the king, but he actually exercises a tremendous amount of power. And you can see here a little bit of his backstory. He was the illegitimate son of one of the kings. And so he basically is disinherited and driven away. And it's only years later, after he escapes captivity and he finds support back among the Frankish military, that he's able to come back, leads a civil war against his cousin, and basically essentially becomes a king of the Franks. Not quite in the same way that Clovis had, but carrying that title. Why he's important here is he plays a critical role. We're now in the early 700s, so we're in the early 8th century. In fact, he picks up the title Savior of Christianity. And the reason for that is, particularly as a military leader, and he was a brilliant military strategist, is that he is tremendously important in a very significant battle that we probably don't spend as much time talking about in terms of world history as we should. And that is in 732, the Battle of Tours. So if you remember, we looked at a map similar to this last week. Remember that Islam arises here in Arabia, then it very quickly explodes out. Eventually, that explosion brings it across North Africa and up and through the Iberian Peninsula, what we think of as being modern-day Spain. And so, as you can see here, by the 750-ish time frame, particularly the area that's here in the sort of the, I don't know what to call that color, purplish, mauve, that is a mauve color. The territories that are controlled by Islam come as far as the mountain chain. The mountain chain that sort of crosses this area right here is the Pyrenees. These are tall, imposing mountains, making it difficult to move across where I'm sort of showing right there. The kingdom of the Franks that we've already looked at is sort of well established here in Western Europe. But now we have the situation where Islam is pressing, and Muslim forces are pressing not only up through the Iberian Peninsula, but are now pushing farther north. And in 732, historians disagree about whether this was a raiding party or whether this was actually a full-scale invasion, but Muslim forces cross over the Pyrenees. They actually work their way into this small territory here, which had been a Roman province. They actually work their way as far north, and look how far north this is, as the city of Tours. And so in 732, Charles Martel leads Frankish forces and other forces that had come to their aid to take on this Muslim army that is marching to the north. And so in 732, and actually in October of 732, we have the Battle of Tours. And Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, is the one who leads the Christian forces, and the Muslim forces have pushed that far north. They are stopped at that particular battle. And so as a result, the expansion of Islam up and through Western Europe doesn't take place. They are driven back to the territory line that you see here. They occupy basically all of the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. And the Pyrenees, for the most part, then becomes the dividing line between Christian kingdoms in Europe and between Islamic kingdoms the term that's used here, because it's actually the European term for this people group, which are actually Berbers from North Africa, the Moors. They actually occupy Spain until 1492, when they're finally driven out. For about 700 years, we'll talk about this during the Crusades, there's an ongoing effort to drive them out of the European continent proper, to drive them off the Iberian Peninsula. And that doesn't fully finally happen until the fall of Cordoba in 1492, to a couple of monarchs perhaps you've heard of, Ferdinand and Isabella, who united their kingdoms together. And one of the ways they've even chosen to unite their two Spanish kingdoms together is to actually unite for the sole purpose of driving Muslim forces out of the rest of the continent. Questions about that? As you well know, Alexis and I do this alternate history podcast thing. One of the interesting what if topics that can be explored there is what happens if Christians lose the Battle of Tours and Islam spreads through Europe in much the same way that it had spread through the rest of the world.
We might be practicing Muslims right now.
There would certainly be a different outcome into most of what we think of as being European history, no doubt. Would Christianity have survived? Absolutely, but again, under different circumstances.
I think different continents that received missionaries at different times too Christianity would have spread. So it would have been like one continent would have been Christian, another continent would have been not just countries.
Yeah. So this is a very important event, this, the Battle of Tours in 732. And again, it's the Franks that are the ones who stand against the expansion of Islam.
And it was pretty much the Charles Martel guy who kind of led the.
He was the guy. He was the leader of the Franks at that time, and he's the one that's able to, because of his role with the military, the Frankish military is able to bring the forces there. He actually is the one who devises the battle strategy at the Battle of Tours. Charles Martel is a very important figure because of what he did at that particular point, just in that particular thing. But also sort of reuniting what Clovis had put together that had sort of fallen apart in terms of the Frankish kingdom. Martel brings that back together, particularly under the concern about the pressing that's going on from the Moors. So that leads us down to Charlemagne. Anybody ever heard of Charlemagne?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Charlemagne is derived from a Latin version of his name, which basically means Charles the Great. And so he is, I think it's fair to say he is considered, certainly by the French, to be like the absolute founding father of modern day France. And he's actually Charles Martel's grandson. And so he rises to the Frankish throne and not only consolidates what had been there before, but actually expands it a great deal. Expands the empire to include what we think was modern day France into more of what we think of as being modern day Germany, and even down into Italy. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means here. And he was considered to be quite a capable leader. Was a powerful military commander, was smart when it came to politics and how to rule things. He was also, pretty much all accounts indicate, he was a very devout Christian. And again, the Christianity here is the form of Orthodox Christianity and not the Arian form of Christianity that had sort of been, had greatly gone on the decline after the rise of Clovis and him promoting Orthodox Christianity from that point forward. As we talk about the parallel path here in a moment for the papacy, you'll see why. And so Charlemagne really expands the Frankish Empire to the maximum extent that we will see it exist for a long period of time. And as you can see, that now not only includes the traditional area that Clovis had united, the other areas that were united as well, but he expands it out into taking the area known as Saxony, as Frisia. He actually comes down and exerts influence or control over this area known as the Spanish March, which is important because this is like the buffer zone between European Christianity and the forces of Islam that maintain and control the Iberian Peninsula. And during the period of time that we're talking about here, the Kingdom of Lombard had been putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Rome and on the papacy, and he actually, through military action and through diplomacy, brings them into a peaceful agreement with the church as well as with himself, sort of brings them under subjugation. So they're not part of his empire proper, in the sense of being part of the full-blown Frankish Empire, but they are brought under the control of the Franks, and them becoming under control is very important because it takes pressure off of how Lombard had been exerting control over Rome and the areas that were still controlled by the centralized church. So Charlemagne blows up the Frankish Empire, the Frankish kingdom, to about the largest extent that it receives. One of the interesting things that happens is shortly after he brings the situation with the Lombards under control, is that he actually visits Rome, and on Christmas Day of the year 800, does anybody know what happens with Charlemagne in Rome on that day?
What year?
800. He is worshiping in not the current St. Peter's that we know now, because that was built much later, but in the original version of St. Peter's Basilica, and the Pope comes over and places a crown upon him and declares that he is the Emperor of the Romans. That basically he has inherited the position of the leader of what had been the western part of the Roman Empire.
Who places this crown on his head?
The Pope.
I didn't think we had a pope yet.
Oh yeah, we do. We're going to talk about that here shortly.
I was waiting for the pope to arrive, and he's already here.
He's already here. And so Charlemagne is either the first Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire becomes a whole different thing politically. We'll hit it as we go through it. I don't want to get there today because it's a little bit confusing. Or he's this and then a later version of it later. But this title is bestowed upon him by the papacy.
What's the title again? Holy.
He's either the Emperor of Rome, or as some will say, he's the first crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor as a title exists throughout history, actually all the way down to the Napoleonic era. So we'll see that moving through as we talk about what's going on in the church in medieval times, but also into the Renaissance and then after that. So politically, things are great up until 1814. Charlemagne dies, and he ends up dividing the kingdom that he's put together into three parts among his three sons. And so this is the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which breaks what had been the kingdom, the Frankish kingdom, Charlemagne's kingdom, up into three parts. Charles, Lothair, and Louis get parts of the kingdom. And as it says here, within 45 years, the land continued to be divided up into smaller and smaller sections. Clovis had united it. Charles Martel had brought it back. Charlemagne definitely brings it together. But then after that, there's no personality to keep it in place. And they start suffering raids from the north, from the folks like the Vikings, who eventually caused things to sort of dismantle. So sort of the peak of Frankish control until much later, when France becomes more what we think of as being France later in history, is in 814 with Charlemagne's death.
Is it Charles the Bald?
Yes. And in fact, some of the names of the leaders of the Franks, what is it, Pepin the Short? They have some interesting little ways of being described in terms of who they were as you go through time there.
And what's it say over on that far right section?
This is sort of just a territory that was more or less under their control, but wasn't part of the formal empire. So that's a big overview of the political side of what goes on in Europe. This is why that's important to know, is how we already talked about how it touches Christianity, but what's important to know is how that parallels the rise of the office of the papacy. So if you remember a couple of weeks back, we talked about you have the fall of political Rome and the rise of what? Ecclesiastical Rome. Those two things are connected. And so the papacy comes to rise in power and influence throughout the entire period of time that we've just covered there, that's going on with the rise of the Franks. And so just now going back a little bit, by the 4th century, you had in the division of the empire into two parts, there were 5 patriarchs that were the agreed sort of areas of control inside of the church. Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople. We talked about this before. This was sort of decided at the Council of Constantinople. Particularly 2 of the patriarchs were important, Rome because of the Western Empire, Constantinople because of the Eastern Empire. But these were all equal. And we still have the idea of patriarchs. The leader of many of the Orthodox churches today are referred to as the patriarchs. So the Eastern Orthodox Church does not have a pope. They have a patriarch. And it derives that term from all the way back in the 4th century. That all makes sense? So how did the Bishop of Rome, which is another title that the Pope carries, how did that evolve? Well, again, we're talking about the period of time when the patriarchs existed. The Bishop of Rome, being one of those 5 patriarchs, had certain importance compared to the other bishops. Where do you think that importance derived from? Being in the capital, being in one of the 2 capitals, being in Rome. But he was not more important, nor did he have authority over the other bishops. So the Bishop of Rome was over the churches that were part of that diocese, that area, the area of the patriarch, but he had no, yeah, go ahead. Somebody say something? He had no authority over the other bishops. However, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 being the demarcation point for that, the bishops of Rome took much more authority that was once held by the Roman government. There no longer was a Roman government in Rome. What was in Rome?
The church.
The church. And so they ended up filling the gap for things that were no longer being done by the political authority. And so what happens here is that the religious office of the Bishop of Rome started to take on more and more of a political aspect because the political leadership in Rome had fallen away. Does that make sense?
So technically the 5 patriarchs were equal to each other.
Correct.
So the head of the church in Jerusalem was
Responsible for the areas of the churches
Right.
that look towards Jerusalem for leadership.
But technically, he and the patriarch in all of the other ones had exactly the same.
They were considered equals. They were
Okay. Did they meet together? I mean, they're so far spread out.
They had, as we've talked about before, the ecumenical councils, other synods. They had meetings where they interacted with each other. Maybe not all 5 of them at a time, but they interacted with each other in various ways and communicated with each other. And they had agreements and disagreements, but generally speaking, remember, all of these patriarchs in this part of the church are all adhering to the Nicene Constantinopolitan version of Christianity, the idea of the Trinity that we spent so much time talking about. They're in agreement on that. This is the quote unquote Orthodox Church. So the position in Rome changes primarily because of not the expansion of Rome expanding, but because of the decline and fall of the political entity. The church steps into a gap. And I think it's a fair thing to say that it was important and a good thing that the church did step into that gap. Because if you looked at how some things as simple as, the provision of what we think of today as being modern hospitals and the distribution of some of the things that the government used to do, if the church had not stepped in during these chaotic times, things could have been far worse. And in fact, we'll see that the church actually probably in many ways had more of an influence on things not being worse in terms of how the Western Empire declined. So, but what does happen here is gradually they become not just religious leaders, but political leaders in Italy. Today, some of you have been there, I think. If you go to the Vatican City, where are you? In the middle of what city?
Rome.
Rome.
Are you in Italy?
No,
Yeah.
technically not. You're in a completely other country.
For that very small area there, and it is a very small area, it's called the Holy See. It's actually recognized as being politically independent from Italy. Now, actually that form of that is very recent, within the last 100 years. But historically, the church has controlled lands. We'll look at that here in a minute, known as the Papal States. And so what happens over time is that the Bishop of Rome, which is one of the titles that the Pope carries today, he's also, by the way, Patriarch of the Western Church. One of the titles that the Pope carries today, there are some political titles that go with that because of this evolution over time. So one of the early first popes to start altering this relationship is Pope Leo I. A couple of key things here. He is actually the first pope that does claim authority over the church. So this is the first time that the claim is made by the Bishop of Rome that there is, and in fact, they would argue, a scriptural reason for primacy as well. Somebody's got to say something? He's a prolific writer, writes an argument called writes a thing called Leo's Tome, which is against the monophysite heresy. Remember, that's the heresy that believes that Jesus is a blended, the Humine version, if you remember the things that we've looked at. Very importantly, though, when Attila is putting pressure on the city of Rome, coming to sack Rome, it's Leo that goes out and basically parlays with Attila and convinces him not to attack the city of Rome. Now, whether he did that through some means of persuasion, if that persuasion included tribute and gold and a bribe, or some combination, historians will differ about that. But he definitely, the very fact of doing that, when the Pope goes outside, that's how he would argue, this is the first Pope, but when the Bishop of Rome goes out to face down a military threat successfully, you sort of cross the line from being just a religious leader, right? Now you're definitely exercising some political role that's there. In fact, he's also the first pope that takes the title of Pontifex Maximus. Anybody remember what that title references? I don't know if we talked about that or not. In the Roman Empire, this was the top religious office in the Roman Empire prior to Rome's conversion to Christianity. This was the title that Roman emperors claimed. So this is in the late 5th century that we have Pope Leo. And again, this is the first real visible thing that we have in terms of an individual pope who is exercising authority that exceeds that of just being the Bishop of Rome. Questions about that?
So this is the guy that took the first title of quote unquote Pope.
You know, that's an interesting thing. Does anybody know where the title of Pope comes from?
No.
It comes from the Latin, or actually the Latin languages of, well, we actually see this in other languages. If I call somebody Papa, what am I calling them?
Yeah.
Father.
Father. And of course, Christian priests are called Father. And so Pope is a derivative of Papa, meaning he's the father of the church. When the term, certainly by the time we get to the latter part of the Frankish periods that we're talking about here, the term was widespread and used. You know, whether Leo would have said, I am Pope, or whether he just would have said, I'm the Bishop of Rome, I really don't know the answer to that question. But he definitely claimed to be the leader of the church. Now, by the way, when this is happening, are there other leaders in other parts of Christendom?
Yes.
Yes.
What year was this again?
This would have been let me flip my note here. This would have been between 440 and 461. So Rome hasn't quite fallen yet.
Pope Leo. Was his name actually Leo before he?
Yes.
Took the title
Yes.
Pontifex Maximus.
Was it Leonardo?
No, it wasn't.
So the tradition of taking another name as the leader had already begun.
Hadn't already begun. That comes along a little bit later.
Okay, so he really was a Leo.
He really was a Leo, to the best of my knowledge. I don't remember reading that he wasn't. Now, subsequent to that is Pope Gregory I, who is also known as Gregory the Great. Gregory is an interesting case study and personality study all in his own. We get the term Gregorian. I think Gregorian, you think Gregorian, what, chants? And he actually preferred, while he eventually became Pope, he actually preferred a monastic type lifestyle. He actually came from a wealthy family. His father was a senator in Rome, and they used a lot of their own money to rebuild Rome after several of the barbarian assaults and to support the poor there. He was a governor in Rome. He spent some time in a monastery, was actually on his way to leading a pilgrimage up north to actually go and spread the gospel on the British Isles when the Pope that was in power at the time died. And basically everybody was so impressed by Gregory and his personality and what he was done, and his record. He was actually acclaimed Pope by acclamation at that point. And so he was made Pope against his will, is one way that you might think of what he did. And he actually becomes much of what we see here in terms of missionary work inside of the organized church and some of the ways that worship was organized owe a great deal to Pope Gregory. So this is now in the early 600s. Gregory is about the time that we have Clovis coming to power. In 756, when Pepin was king of the Franks, they defeat the Lombards. We talked about that group that had been put pressure on Rome, and he donated the land that the Lombards had occupied to the papacy, and this is what later becomes the Papal States.
Huh.
So how do you end up with the Pope's ruling a territory known as the Papal States? It's because what had been the area of the Lombards were given to them by the Franks after they assumed, after they removed the Lombards as a threat. And so again, the line between religious leader and civil political leader gets even further blurred, as now you have these areas known as the Papal States there in Italy, where the Pope, the leader of the church, the Bishop of Rome, also has the title of being over these Papal States.
Are there still Papal States outside of the, like where St. Peter's is and stuff like that?
Not today.
No,
Not
they've
today.
all kind of.
Yeah. But the Papal States existed in Italy until 1870. So, I mentioned before Charlemagne. So he's the son of Pepin, and now Pope Leo III. So you do have the idea of here this continuing on of,
Wait. I thought he was related to Charles Martel.
He's his grandson.
So Pepin is Charles Martel's son?
Correct. And Charlemagne, again, is responsible for finishing up this situation with the Lombards. And again, on Christmas Day of 800, he is crowned as the first Holy Roman Emperor by Leo III. And so now Charlemagne, the highest extent of the Frankish expansion of power, is connected. The point I want to make here, maybe not doing a good job of it, see the connection between Frankish politics and the church, particularly the papacy. See the connections that have existed here?
Yes.
The Franks owe a lot of their influence to the fact that they are closely connected with the formal Orthodox Church represented by the popes. The popes are supported by and are being defended by whom? The Franks. These two things are connected. So what is the line between church and state? during this period of time.
Very blurry.
Very blurry.
Yeah.
Very blurry. And again, Charlemagne, almost every biographer will tell you he was a very devout believer. He didn't just potentially like Clovis, who may have been like Constantine initially, just give lip service to Christianity. He was a believer. In fact, instead of having music played at his meals, one of the things that apparently he loved to have done was actually have things recited or performed. One of the things that he would have recited would be Augustine's City of God. He actually liked to have the book read
Wow.
as,
While he
as
was
the,
eating.
as the entertainment at a meal. What, Doug?
While he was eating, listening to the City of God. That's interesting.
And while everybody else was forced to eat with him because he was the king, right?
That's one way to make sure everybody becomes literate and
Right.
and learns.
And is known for his great support of, again, known for his great support of the church. This relationship, this symbiotic relationship that existed between the organized formal church and particularly the Frankish kingdom was quite important. And again, remember the role that the Franks had played literally just 732 is what, 68 years before? What had happened? The Muslims had come as far as halfway up into the Frankish kingdom looking to expand. And so there was a tremendous amount of desire by the church leadership in Rome to make sure that the Frankish kingdom was strong. Why? It was what was standing between them and the expansion, particularly of Islam.
Wow.
Now, what does happen here over time is as the popes became more powerful, both religiously and politically, there was a lot more competition to become pope. And so by the late 9th century, several families in Rome sought to control the papacy. In fact, if you look at most of the history of the papacy from around the year 1000 through really to the Reformation and a little bit beyond, you see that it's constantly a fight over who's going to control the office, because what came with it was obviously wealth, but also what came with it was power. And so again, by the middle of the 10th century, the popes begin to have the series of the corrupt popes that come along, that you had these situations where the pope was being bought sometimes to declare who the Holy Roman Emperor was, and vice versa. The title of Holy Roman Emperor became something of a bargaining chip in political negotiations.
So were the patriarchs at all of the other locations also now calling themselves pope, or did they continue to call themselves patriarch? And did there kind of become a problem between the patriarch / pope in Rome kind of becoming so powerful?
There ultimately we will see that. In fact, that's the next place we're going to go. We're going to see that there arises, because of this expansion of what's happening with the papacy in what had been the western half of the empire, that the relationships between the church, but also politically, the relationships between what had been the western part of the empire and the eastern part of the empire become strained, and the relationships between the western church and the eastern church continue to be strained. One of the key critical moments in that is this event right here.
Right.
Because where is Charlemagne from?
France.
He's a Frank. He's a descendant of these Germanic tribes that are in Europe. What is this, why is he proclaimed essentially the equivalent of the Emperor of Rome? And by the way, when the Pope did this on Christmas Day at 800, he did not consult with any leadership in the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of the empire, what had been the eastern part of the empire, on this decision. This was solely his call. And so West and East, which had already been drifting apart, we're going to actually next week talk about that, because that sets up sort of the final thing before we get towards the Reformation, is that this is one of the events during that period of time that causes that strain. Eventually, you will get to the middle of the 11th century, and there will be a complete break, for the most part, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. It finally comes to a head. It comes to a head in such a way that the two patriarchs excommunicate each other. The Pope in Rome says that the patriarch of the Eastern Church is a heretic, and the patriarch of the Eastern Church says that the leader of the Western Church is a heretic. That's ultimately what it comes to.
But weren't there 5 total?
Yes, but if you go back to that, let me go back to it, that other slide. Oh, where's it at? No, I had it in the stack. Pretty sure I had it in the stack. Meant to have it in the stack. Here. Yeah. The two primary were Rome and Constantinople. Jerusalem was almost a emeritus, yeah, that's a good word for it, almost symbolic situation. Antioch and Alexandria, remember, had been early centers in early Christianity. Remember, we talked about even the conflict between the way of interpreting scripture of the Antioch school and the Alexandrian school. They had diminished in authority. What ultimately happens over time, we'll talk about this a little bit later next week, is that these political lines that were drawn did eventually become to a great degree the religious lines that were drawn. Over time, the patriarch in Constantinople, while not taking the title of Pope, exerted a tremendous amount of influence over Christianity in the eastern half of what had been the Roman Empire. Good question. What else? That's all I was planning to do today. Just want to get this background in the back.
Hey, Don, it's Albert.
Yep.
Hey, I haven't read really into it, but that there was a peace treaty between the United Arab Emirates and Israel.
I saw somebody's going to recognize somebody this week. Yeah.
Yeah, they're sending apparently diplomatic recognition and begin trade negotiations and all kinds of stuff like that.
Which is notable because with the exception of, I think this is still true, I think Egypt is still the only Arab nation that had formally recognized Israel prior to this.
I think so, yeah.
That was part of the Camp David Accords. So that goes back
Yes.
to the late 70s.
Hey, do you have a map of like current day to kind of lay over like Spain and France and all of that? Am I that part of geography? Like, is that still all like,
Oops.
I don't know,
No.
maybe y'all are all better at European nations than I am, but like where France ends and where
There we go.
what's that purple above France?
There we go.
That would be, that's Belgium.
Belgium, Netherlands.
So again, the area, to Kathy's point, the area that we're talking about here that was under Frankish control in a modern sense incorporates France, Belgium, the Netherlands,
Part of Germany.
Switzerland, and then the influence area, modern Italy. But this whole area here has been under, historically, all kinds, Naples and other types of kingdoms were all separate throughout here, even when the papal states existed, which are in this area right here. Okay. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because I want to have the